So if you're like me and you have a morbid curiosity, you've probably seen a good amount of horror movies. However, very rarely will you encounter a film that strikes a nerve in the viewer, a film that passes the line between scary and disturbing. It can be a challenge finding a genuinely disturbing movie, but lucky for us, Reddit user SluttySissy69 took care of that. I want to say again, content warning for tier 2 and down, shit hits the fan pretty quick and a lot of this stuff can be triggering, so if you get uncomfortable talking about these sorts of things, I highly recommend not watching this video. Also, I want to say this, Iceberg includes absolutely 0 mixtapes, 0 pornography, and 0 snuff films. Everything you're about to hear, excluding the documentaries, are movies and not actual death. Alright, with all that stuff out of the way, let's jump right in. Saw is a 2004 horror film directed by James Wan. In it, we follow 2 men chained to opposite corners of a bathroom playing a deadly game put on by the Jigsaw Killer. This series has 9 installments detailing various torture traps and scenarios for people deemed unworthy of life. The Blair Witch Project is a 1999 supernatural horror film directed by Daniel Myrick and Eduardo Sanchez. The film consists of recorded footage of 3 missing filmmakers camping in the woods investigating a being known as the Blair Witch. Psycho is a 1960 horror film by filmmaker Alfred Hitchcock. In it, we follow the victims of a mentally ill motel owner as he stalks his guests. The Birds is a 1963 horror film from Alfred Hitchcock. In it, we follow a series of unexplained violent bird attacks in a California town. It is a 1990 miniseries directed by Tommy Lee Wallace. In it, we follow a group of friends fighting with a shape-shifting being hiding in the sewers of their town that feasts on children. Insidious is a 2010 horror film directed by James Wan. It follows a young couple dealing with the possession of their young son. The Conjuring is a 2013 horror film directed by James Wan that follows one of the most famous cases of the infamous Warrens. Jaws is a 1975 film directed by Steven Spielberg following a series of shark attacks on a beach. Sinister is a 2012 film by Scott Derrickson following a writer who moves into a house that had all of its previous inhabitants murdered. The Exorcist is a 1973 film directed by William Friedkin following the demonic possession of a 12-year-old girl and 2 priests attempting to save her. Halloween is a horror movie franchise following a serial killer known as Michael Myers as he stalks and kills various people. Friday the 13th is a horror movie franchise following the serial killer Jason Voorhees as he stalks and kills various people. Wrong Turn is a 2003 horror film directed by Rob Schmidt following a group of teens stalked by cannibals living in the West Virginia wilderness. Spotlight is a 2015 film directed by Paul McCarthy following a group of newspaper journalists investigating in the Catholic Church. Sicario is a 2015 action thriller directed by Denis Villeneuve that follows FBI agents attempting to bring down a brutal Mexican drug cartel. Ex Machina is a 2014 science fiction film directed by Alex Garland following a programmer invited to his boss's house to test out a robot with artificial intelligence. Dawn of the Dead is a 1978 horror classic directed by the late George A. Romero following survivors of a zombie apocalypse taking refuge in a mall. The Game is a 1997 film directed by David Fincher, following a wealthy banker who gets invited to play a mysterious game by his younger brother. Gone Girl is a 2014 psychological thriller directed by David Fincher, following the investigation into a man who has become the prime suspect in his wife's disappearance. Black Swan is a 2010 psychological horror film directed by Darren Aronofsky, following a ballerina who begins to lose her grip on reality after the pressure of an upcoming recital pushes her too far. Contagion is a 2011 thriller directed by Steven Soderbergh that follows various people's reactions to the outbreak of a deadly airborne virus. Congratulations! If you're watching, we've all survived a Tier 1 disturbing movie situation. Hellraiser is a 1987 supernatural horror film directed by Clive Barker that follows a man who solves a puzzle box that summons demons from hell. The Hills Have Eyes is a 1977 horror film directed by the late Wes Craven following a family of cannibals that kill an unlucky family with car trouble. Oldboy is a 2003 thriller directed by Park Chan-wook following a man released from 15 years of captivity and given 5 days to uncover the reason for his capture. The Hunt is a 2020 horror film directed directed by Craig Zobel, that follows a group of wealthy elites hunting down a group of people that insulted and leaked private information online. Midsummer is a 2019 horror film directed by Ari Aster that follows a group of friends traveling to Sweden to celebrate a pagan holiday with a Scandinavian cult. Hereditary is a 2018 horror film directed by Ari Aster following a family dealing with the fallout of their grandmother's death. Seven is a 1995 crime film directed by David Fincher following detectives investigating a series of murders modeled after the 7 Deadly Sins. A Clockwork Orange is a 1971 dystopian film directed by Stanley Kubrick that follows a violent, mentally disturbed man going through experimental psychotherapeutic treatments. The Strangers is a 2008 horror film directed by Brian Bertino that follows a group of criminals that stalk and murder a random couple. Bone Tomahawk is a 2015 Western film that follows a sheriff leading a rescue mission to save 3 people that were abducted by a cannibalistic Indian tribe. Lost Highway is a 1997 surrealist film that follows a musician convicted of murder. I Saw the Devil is a crime thriller following a man hunting down the psychopath who murdered his fiancée. Festin is a dark comedy about a family reunion that includes physical abuse, suicide, and racism. Texas Chainsaw Massacre follows a group of friends who accidentally stumble into the path of a cannibalistic serial killer known as Leatherface. Crash follows a film producer who joins a group of people sexually obsessed with car accidents. Hostel follows a group of friends abducted by a company that captures and tortures tourists. Requiem for a Dream follows 4 people whose lives spiral out of control after becoming addicted to various substances. Dancer in the Dark follows a Czech immigrant suffering from an eye condition working in factories to support her son. The Woman follows the last surviving member of a cannibalistic tribe living in the woods as she attacks random people. Raw follows a veterinarian student that develops a craving for raw meat after a hazing ritual affects her in strange ways. Suicide Circle follows the police's desperate attempt to stop a series of random mass suicides in Japan. Freaks follows a trapeze artist's plan to seduce and murder a dwarf to steal his inheritance and the revenge the other freak show performers plan to exact on her. Elephant is an extremely realistic look at the moments leading up to a school shooting. Climax follows the trip a dance troupe goes on after they have been spiked with LSD and locked into a building. Under the Skin follows some being pretending to be a woman who preys on the men of Scotland. The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo follows a man and a computer hacker searching for a girl he knew in his childhood who had disappeared 40 years prior. Last House on the Left follows a 17-year-old girl that gets abducted and tortured by a family of psychopaths. I Spit on Your Grave follows a woman who enacts revenge on the 4 men who her and left her for dead. Possession follows an international spy coming home to find his wife asking for a divorce, followed by her exhibiting disturbing behavior, including self-mutilation and murder. Kids is an excruciatingly realistic look at kids growing up in 90s New York City, acted and inspired by real-life kids from the area. Hard Candy follows a young girl befriending and torturing a sexual predator. Mysterious Skin follows the lives of 2 young boys that were sexually abused by their coach and the 2 paths they took that show different ways trauma can manifest in someone's future. Bad Boy Bubby follows the life of a mentally ill man that is held in captivity by his own mother and his subsequent escape. La Bête is a French erotic horror film that follows the arranged marriage of a young woman and a horrifically disfigured man with monstrous tendencies. The Eyes of My Mother follows a woman throughout her life as she tortures and mutilates several people. I don't want to give away too much, but she has a tendency of taking people's eyes and vocal cords out and keeping them chained in her barn. And I mean, she does that to a couple people throughout the movie. Naked follows the life of Johnny Fletcher, an amoral rapist asshole, while he wanders around East London worsening the lives of everyone he meets. Enter the Void follows the perspective of a recently deceased drug dealer living in Japan as he wanders through his memories and the lives of his friends and families that he's left behind. Ex-Drummer follows a writer that gets asked to play in a band comprised of only handicapped people. I personally didn't find anything too disturbing with this movie. Eraserhead is a surrealist film by David Lynch that follows a man left to care for his deformed son. Snowtown is based on the real-life Snowtown murders that were committed by 4 men in Australia in the early 90s. The men robbed, tortured, and murdered various people and infamously disposed their bodies by stuffing them in barrels and putting them in abandoned bank vaults. Sympathy for Mr. Vengeance follows a poor deaf mute man that is working desperately to be able to afford his sister's kidney operation. He tries everything, but he is fired from work and is robbed by organ dealers. At his breaking point, he kidnaps the daughter of a wealthy man and holds her for ransom. Pink Flamingos is the infamous cult classic starring the drag queen Divine that follows a criminal named Babs Johnson who is proud to be the filthiest person alive. Divine is confronted by 2 criminals who claim they can outdo her filth, so they begin to compete. I probably don't have to mention this scene because of how famous it is, but yes, there is a scene where Divine eats actual dog poop in this movie. Guilty of Romance weaves 2 separate stories together. The first follows the murder of a woman in a love hotel, and the second a romantic novelist that is bored with her own marriage that begins a new career as a nude model. Maniac follows a man who scalps and mutilates various people because in his mind, beauty is a crime punishable by death. Ilza, she-wolf of the SS, follows a female concentration camp commander that enjoys torturing people with her sadistic experiments. Nymphomaniac tells the story of Jo, a woman who develops a sex addiction after an assault. And if that's not disturbing enough, the full version of this movie is over 5 hours long. The Cook, the Thief, His Wife, and Her Lover follows 4 people's lives who gets mixed in criminal and sexual ways. Don't want to give away too much because I really recommend this movie, but there are scenes of forced cannibalism and a scene where a guy gets tortured to death by force-feeding him a book. Repulsion follows a disturbed woman dealing with vivid nightmarish hallucinations where a shadowy figure breaks into her apartment. 29 Palms follows 2 people who don't speak the same language, traveling through the desert, fighting and fucking to pass the time, until they are abducted by a group of rednecks and torture the pair. Eden Lake follows a couple on a vacation to the English countryside who finds themselves on the run from a gang of sadistic teenagers. High Tension, or Switchblade Romance as it's known in the UK, follows 2 students hiding from a serial killer. Frontiers follows a gang of young Arabs on the run from neo-Nazis after the election of a far-right president sparks riots. An American Crime is a retelling of the infamous Sylvia Likens case where Sylvia Likens was tortured and killed by her caretaker, as well as her children and several other neighborhood kids. The New York Ripper follows the police investigation into a prolific serial killer that targets women. This movie sounds kind of like an average slasher, just with graphic violence, so that's all I'm gonna say about that. Dogtooth follows an abusive family that keeps their children on their property and isolates them from the rest of the world. The children grow up learning random things that their parents teach them, like cats are dangerous and that incest is okay. However, one of them soon begins to learn what life in the real world is actually like. Hostel has literally the same premise as the first one, except it follows the torture and death of 3 female art students and not a couple of dude bros trying to get laid. The House That Jack Built follows a serial killer retelling the stories of various murders he had committed throughout his life to someone. I don't want to say who it is because it kind of spoils the movie, but Bruno Ganz does a fantastic job in portraying him. The Poughkeepsie Tapes is a mockumentary following the murderer Edward Carver. Carver has recorded 800 videotapes showing his abduction, torture, and murder of several people, and it is of this footage that the movie is mostly comprised of. Some of the standout scenes include emotional abuse of a grieving mother and the decapitation of a man's head only to put it inside the mutilated body of his wife. Strange Circus follows the assistant to a disabled erotic novelist who begins his own investigation into the possible truth behind one of her darkest stories, which involves incest and suicide. We Need to Talk About Kevin follows the mother of Kevin, a psychologically disturbed young man that emotionally abuses her since he was a child. However, as he begins to grow up, he exhibits more and more violent and psychopathic behavior. Class follows 2 boys who decide to enact brutal revenge on the bullies that have been harassing and abusing them throughout school. A lot of the disturbing things comes from the bullies themselves, however, as they repeatedly beat the boys bloody and at one point force one of them to perform fellatio on the other at knife point. Of Freaks and Men follows a photographer that infiltrates well-off families and ruins their lives. like, for example, having their daughter star in pornos he shoots in a theater he created honoring Marquise de Sade. Lilia Forever follows the life of a poor young girl as she gets imprisoned and prostituted by a pimp. We also follow the disembodied spirit of one of her friends who had killed himself after her disappearance. Antichrist follows an unnamed couple going to spend some nights in an isolated cabin in the woods after the death of their young son. Soon the woods turn harsh against the man, and the woman becomes increasingly more violent and sexual. Gummo follows the lives of random people in a town in Ohio shortly after a tornado. The people we follow, mostly children, pass their meaningless time with various acts including the killing of animals, huffing glue, baths in dirty water, forced prostitution of a disabled girl, boxing, and satanic rituals. Happiness is a dark comedy film that interconnects various stories of people in suburbia, including a child molester preying on his son's friends and a socially awkward man who harasses women over the phone. Tetsuo follows the life of a man who is slowly turning into machinery. Audition follows a widower setting up auditions to select a woman to be his new wife. The woman he selects tortures him in the infamous final scene of this movie with needles and paralytics. Life and Death of a Porno Gang follows a failed porn director that gets approached by a man that suggests he makes snuff films. The Cremator follows a cremator turned mass murderer in 1930s Prague who believes his acts of violence purify his diseased victims. The Piano Teacher follows a extremely sexually repressed and lonely woman that enters a relationship with her student as her darker side begins to manifest itself in violent sexual ways. Hard to Be God follows life on another planet, one that is still stuck in a medieval period, and any advancement in technology or education is destroyed. The narrative follows the life of an Earthling sent to live on this planet and civilians believing him to be the son of one of their gods. Singapore Sling follows the incestuous relationship of a severely delusional mother and daughter as they play BDSM games as well as have sex with the mummified corpse of their abusive patriarch. Inside follows a pregnant widow who is stalked and harassed by another woman who wants to take her baby. The Seventh Continent follows the life of an upper-class Austrian family as they go through their daily routines. It's monotonous and boring until they announce they're moving to Australia. They then proceed to destroy everything they own and kill themselves. We also get an extended sequence of the father ripping up all of his cash and flushing it down the toilet. The Vanishing begins with a young couple stopping at a gas station. Rex fills the tank and his girlfriend Saskia goes into the station, however she is never seen again. 3 years later, Rex is still looking for Saskia, and eventually the kidnapper confesses to him his guilt. He says he will show him what he did to her, but only if he is willing to experience it. Rex, doing the stupidest thing I've literally ever seen anyone do in a horror movie, agrees and wakes up buried alive in a coffin. The movie ends with the kidnapper reading about the disappearance in the newspaper, surrounded by his wife and children. Who Can Kill a Child follows an expecting couple on vacation on a Spanish island. The island's entire inhabitants are children who've been driven mad by the effects of war and have killed all adults on the island. Soon the children begin attacking the couple and even going as far as somehow convincing their unborn child to kill the mother. Cannibal Holocaust is a found footage film consisting of the brutal murders of a couple of assholes that fuck with a cannibalistic tribe. The movie is famous for two reasons, the first being that the violence was so graphic and realistic that the director was arrested on suspicion that he had actually killed his actors, and the second being the extremely long and drawn out sequences of unsimulated animal abuse. Men Behind the Sun is an unflinching look at the war crimes and experiments conducted by the Japanese government on Chinese and Soviet prisoners. The treatment of the prisoners includes, but is not limited to, organ harvesting and using them as targets for prototype weapons. Cold Fish follows the life of an unhappy family that owns a fish market. After an encounter with a man who owns a bigger, more successful fish market than him, the man and his daughter begin to work for him. Unfortunately for them, the man and his wife turn out to be serial killers. The Human Centipede follows a mentally ill man obsessed with the movie The Human Centipede, who sets out to make his own creation. Shogun's Sadism follows two stories, one of a girl who gets turned into a slave and tortured, and one of a brothel master falling in love and trying to escape. I couldn't find out much about this movie, but it's a sequel to something called Shogun's Joy of Torture, so you can kind of figure out the vibes. Cargo 200 follows the abduction and abuse of a woman that culminates in her abductor finding out her fiancé was killed in Afghanistan, having the coffin shipped to his house, and then throwing his dead body at her. Calvaire follows a man who becomes victim to a delusional hermit, believing him to be his promiscuous wife that had left him years earlier. His experiences with the man include being dressed as his wife and forced to sleep with him, murder, and a crucifixion. Philosophy of a Knife follows the extremely disturbing experiments conducted by the Japanese Unit 731 on prisoners of war. If I went through everything they did, we'd be here all day, so I'm only mentioning that Unit 731 often performed surgeries to examine the organs while they still function, on men, women, and children, often while the person was still alive, conscious, and fully aware. Viva la Muerte follows a boy whose father has been imprisoned and possibly killed for being a suspected communist shortly after the Spanish Civil War. Feed follows the investigation into a fetish website for morbidly obese women. The reason for the investigation? The guy running the site force feeds them until they die. And if that's not enough, this movie starts with a guy getting his dick cut off. Tierische Liebe is a documentary following the lives of lonely people lacking human connection growing more attached to their animal companions. As far as I know, this is not a film about bestiality, however it does include lots of graphic sexual content and violence, as well as being extremely depressing. Dumplings follows a former actress who believes her beauty is leaving because of her age. She meets with a woman who prepares her special dumplings that will make her look good again. The ingredients of the dumpling consists of the meat of aborted incestuous fetuses. My Chan's Daily Life, the movie, is about a building that puts out help wanted ads in order to lure in young girls for abuse, cannibalism, and murder. Zoo follows the real life of Kenneth Pinion, a man who performed in and distributed zoophilic pornography with 2 other men. In 2005, he died of a perforated colon after an incident involving a horse. I'll let you figure out the rest from there. Jagdsaison aus Niederbayern, or its English title, Hunting Seasons from Bavaria, follows a town hunting down a man who killed a servant. Come and See follows a young Belarusian boy as he signs up to fight in the Soviet resistance unit during World War II. This movie is known for being one of the most brutal depictions of war, and including several scenes of the worst of human behavior. In a Glass Cage follows the surviving victim of a Nazi doctor's journey to track him back down, pose as his caretaker, and then recreate all the torturous experiments performed on him. Salo, or the 120 Days of Sodom, is Pier Paolo Pasolini's infamous final work, depicting the brutal torture of several teenagers at the hands of 4 wealthy men. Henry, Portrait of a Serial Killer, follows Henry as he travels across America and kills several random people. Henry, as well as the story, is based on the real-life killer Henry Lee Lucas, who confessed to over 600 murders. Martyrs follows the life of Lucy, who escaped from horrific torture and abuse she endured as a child. Being placed in an orphanage, she soon befriends another girl named Anna, who comforts her when she is attacked by a disfigured woman. The two grow up and eventually track down the people responsible for her torture and kill them. There's a lot more to the story, but I really recommend watching this yourself. This has one of the better endings. Irreversible follows the revenge 2 men take on a rapist that left their friend in a coma. The movie's presented to us in reverse order, however, with the revenge happening first and the context given later. This movie is also infamous because the scene where the actual takes place is unbearably long and graphic. I Stand Alone follows the life of a man known to us only as the Butcher. Not much to say about the plot since there pretty much isn't one, but the Butcher is an incredibly lonely and unstable man, and the movie deals a lot with and incest. The Act of Killing is a documentary following the Indonesian mass killings of the suspected communists in the 60s. The documentarians interview people who were involved with the murders and their feelings about the crimes they committed. The film is incredibly disturbing because most of the people simply don't care or acknowledge their past and don't actually regret it. They also recreate the killings on camera and laugh about the deaths of their victims. Funny Games follows 2 young men who torture and kill a family for no reason. One of the killers breaks the 3rd wall several times and asks the viewer what he thinks will happen next. Man Bites Dog follows a documentary crew that is making a film on the acts committed by a serial killer. At first, the crew interviews him and gets to know him, then they observe him while he murders people. In the beginning, they don't get involved, but as the film progresses, the crew gradually becomes accomplices and help him kill people. Subconscious Cruelty is an anthology consisting of segments titled Ovarian Eyeball, Human Larva, Rebirth, and Right/Brain Martyrdom. Guinea Pig Film Series refers to an extremely graphic Japanese series of gore porn. Ebola Syndrome follows a murderer fleeing to South Africa and contracting the Ebola virus after a dying woman. He becomes a living carrier for the disease and purposely spreads it throughout South Africa. Kichiku, or The Banquet of Beasts, follows a group of students living in an apartment in Tokyo. The group's leader has been in prison for a while, and shortly before his release, he kills himself. Upon hearing the news, the group goes crazy and start to kill each other. There Is a Secret in My Soup follows 3 gangsters who torture, kill, dismember, and cook a woman who stole from them. The movie ends with them hiding her skull in a Hello Kitty doll. Grotesque is an extreme torture film that includes acts like cutting off tongues, dismemberment, removing nipples, popping out eyes, decapitation, disembowelment, making a necklace out of fingers, and just making holes in people. The situation is worsened by the fact that the psychopath is a doctor that treats their wounds so they can survive longer. A Hole in My Heart is an experimental film that consists of a man filming amateur porn in his apartment while his son hangs around and tries not to get in his way. Thanatomorphos follows a young woman trapped in an abusive relationship that begins to decompose as if she were dead. Cannibal follows a man who does exactly what you would guess to his victim. The most disturbing part of this film is that the victim is a suicidal man who consents to his torture and murder. The Bunny Game follows a sex worker who gets abducted by a truck driver and forced to play violent games of torture. Can't find too much else on this movie, nor do I really want to, so I'm just gonna leave you with the fact that this movie was rejected by the BBFC and said it would be a risk to the public. Dear Zachary, A Letter to a Son About His Father is an extremely depressing documentary about the murder of Andrew Bagby. He had been in a relationship with Shirley Turner, but when they broke up, she drove across the country and shot him 5 times. Shortly after, she revealed to Andrew's parents that she was pregnant with his son and gave birth, all while avoiding jail time and forcing Andrew's parents to maintain a civil relationship with her in order for visitation rights. Eventually she was convicted and arrested. However, a judge named Gail Welsh, who I'm going to shame here because they're a piece of shit who deserve to be disbarred, actually released a convicted murderer because she felt that Turner posed no real threat to society. Turner was released and later sued the parents of her victim, gaining parental rights again until she eventually killed her son as well as herself. The documentarians tried to contact Gail and the prosecutors for an interview, but were ignored by both. Playground is a Polish film that follows 2 young boys on the last day of school. The boys feel a lot of hate and anger with their own lives and take it out on their parents, stray dogs, and even a girl who confesses her feelings to one of them. This movie ends in literally one of the most heartbreaking and evil ways with a reenactment of the murder of James Bulger. If you don't already know who that is or what happened to him, I don't recommend looking it up. Begotten is an experimental silent horror film that starts with a being credited as God killing himself, disemboweling himself with a razor. From his organs arises his mother Earth, who then impregnates herself and gives birth to the son of Earth, a disfigured man that is soon abandoned by her. I literally don't know what the fuck happens next, so I'm just gonna leave it at that. Angst follows a psychopath released from prison desperate to kill again. The movie focuses on his torture of a family of 3, a mother and her 2 children. Red Room follows 4 contestants of a brutal game forced to torture each other in order to be the last one standing. The Embryo Hunts in Secret and Tumbling Doll of Flesh are torture horror films that don't have much else going on. Black Metal Veins is a documentary following the total hopelessness of 5 young heroin addicts. It is extremely depressing to watch and unsimulated, meaning that heroin use and sex in the film were all real. I shit you not, one of the 5 overdoses and the director just keeps filming it and doesn't do anything. The Green Elephant is just 2 prisoners doing insane shit. I don't really know how else to put it. Just reading the description of this movie sickens and confuses me. I have heard that the acting in this movie is extremely good, and it has become a bit of a cult classic. Celluloid Nightmares follows a woman stumbling upon a snuff film and then getting stalked by the film's creators. Fetus follows a man who has lost his wife during the birth of their son. Desperate to get her back, he begins to look for ways to bring her back to life. he tries to bring her back to life using some device that uses the corpse of his wife and the dismembered head of his own baby. He then also gives birth to a baby out of his mutilated penis for some reason. Now, this was the attempt that worked. He actually tried various different ways of bringing his wife back, and it's just fucked up. Don't watch this movie. Aftermath is a brutally depressing movie following survivors of a nuclear explosion. They hide out in a house trying to survive radiation poisoning, but this movie is about as hopeless as their situation is. And finally, the last movie, Vase de Noces, follows a mentally disturbed man living on a farm that spends his time putting dolls on pigeons, decapitating animals, and collecting his poop in a jar. Oh yeah, and he also a pig. The pig later gives birth and the piglets reject him, choosing instead to spend time with their mother, which he takes personal. As revenge, he takes the piglets, hangs them, and leaves them for their mother to find, which results in the pig's suicide. He finds the body of the pig, buries it, and the film ends with him hanging himself. And that's the end of the fucking iceberg. I think I'm done with disturbing shit for a while, but leave some comments and maybe I'll put in a couple review videos watching some of these movies in full. Alright, I'm gonna go watch Encanto again, so have a good rest of your day, and I'll see you next time.